Hello, everyone, and welcome. We will go ahead and get started. So welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending the ISMTE 2021 Global event and for joining us for this session, What's in a Name? Everything. My name is Shayna Lang. I work at the American Chemical Society in our Publications Division, and I'll be moderating today's session. I'm really excited to kick off this session. Apart from being involved in ACS's author name change policy launched last year, I've had the pleasure of collaborating with our speakers on related DEI initiatives. I do want to note before we begin that today's speakers declare no conflicts of interest in relation to this presentation. And our big thanks go out to our sponsors who are making this session possible. So we'll first hear from Dr. Irving Rettig on the need for post-publication name changes. Irving is an inorganic chemist and postdoctoral researcher in the Bowering Lab at Reed College. He received his bachelor's degree in chemistry from Pitzer College in 2014 and completed his PhD in inorganic chemistry in May 2021 at Portland State University. Irving is a founding member of the Name Change Policy Working Group, a group comprised of transgender and genderqueer academics and cisgender allies that collaborates with journals and publishers to adopt more inclusive name change policies that better accommodate transgender authors. He's also a member of the Committee on Publication Ethics, or COPE, subgroup on name change policies, which is developing new guidance on name change policies for all 12,000 of its member journals. We'll then hear from Anna O'Brien with a publisher perspective on name change policies. Anna is the Senior Editorial Director at Wiley. She has more than 25 years experience in scholarly publishing in both production and editorial capacities and across a number of disciplines. Anna currently leads the global team at Wiley responsible for the economics, business, and finance journals portfolio, working with multiple societies and professional associations in these disciplines. She has a specialized interest in diversity, equity, and inclusion in publishing. We are going to hold questions until after the presenters have finished, but feel free to submit your questions at any time during the presentation using the Q&A feature. And if you want to direct your question at either Irving or Anna specifically, feel free to indicate that in the question. So we want to start off actually with a poll, which we'll come back to at the end of the session with a follow-up. And let me launch the poll. You should be able to see that on your screens. We want to know if you're coming from a journal or publishing organization. Does your journal or publisher currently accommodate post-publication author name changes? So the options are yes, we provide an inclusive path to updating names. Yes, but it's not as inclusive as it could be. No, but we're planning to change this policy soon. No, and we have no plans to do so. Or I'm not sure. And we know there might be some room for interpretation on what defines an inclusive policy, which of course we'll go into, but if you could answer to the best of your knowledge. So we have a few votes coming in, and it looks like all of them so far are yes, we provide an inclusive path to updating names, which is great. I will give folks a couple more seconds and then close the poll in 3, 2, 1. And there we go. So yeah, it looks like out of the 6 folks that voted, they all have inclusive path to updating names, which is awesome to hear. All right, so thank you all for participating. I'm going to turn it over now to Irving.
Thanks, Shayna. And I can sort of just say next for slide changes since you're in charge of that. So that would, like Shayna was saying, my name's Irving. I use he and they pronouns, and I have been sort of there since the beginning with the name change policy working group in sort of pushing this this idea that current, or I guess I can't say current now because so many people have changed them, but previous name change policies, were not supportive of the diversity of authors that we're seeing in the publishing world. You can go ahead and change the next slide, Shayna. And so I sort of want to start just with this very sort of brief introduction, kind of coming from a very macroscopic view of name change policies. And I think a really good way to sort of start thinking about, just why we need to have inclusive policies, and in particular, inclusive name change policies. I think we really need to go back and think about, just where publishing started. And I think a really good way of doing that involves this quote from Malkia Sorrell, who is a media justice activist. And in a talk that they gave, they said that technologies reflect the biases of the makers and the implicit rules of society. And essentially what that means is that, when these technologies first surfaced, that they were developed by a specific demographic who had only ever interacted with other people that looked and behaved and acted exactly like them. And so they didn't consider that the sort of rules that they were developing while implementing this technology could do harm to other individuals. And we're seeing now that as we're at this sort of really interesting paradigm shift, not only in publishing, but kind of on a global scale, that, that in many cases, technologies and policies have not actually been able to support an entire population, but instead a small subsection, while the rest of the population is suffering. And specifically in publishing, where this manifested, was in the ways that that authors had power over their own identity in their published works. And I encountered this problem during my third year of grad school. I had been out as transgender for about a year and a half, and I was starting to look at postdoctoral opportunities and other job opportunities, upon graduating. And I realized that as I was reaching out to these people that I was interested in working for, I would have to send them my manuscripts that looked like this, where in the actual PDF or in the link, I actually put a black box over my name, and I, reassured them, I promise I am not taking credit for something that somebody else did. This is me. And, but it's a name that I chose to leave behind, something that the transgender community typically calls a dead name. And my dead name is on this paper. And everyone has told me there's nothing I can do about it. And in order to, show to you that I, am a decorated academic, I have to put it, I have to include it. That leaving it out wasn't really an option for me because I was, I'm an early career scientist. And after getting lots of pushback, I found a community of other transgender authors who had sort of encountered a similar problem, that they were not feeling supported and actually getting pushback from journals for, requesting name changes. You can go to the next slide. And it was sort of from that shared frustration between this group of academics that were experiencing a problem that seemed to be something that was more structural on the part of the publisher than, on the individuals. We formed the Name Change Policy Working Group. And this is a group of predominantly transgender and non-binary authors from all academic disciplines. And we were working on sort of pushing journals sort of at the base to be able to listen to us and listen to the ways in which their current policies were not supportive of, replacing a dead name in a published article. And, when we first started meeting with journals, there was a lot of concerns about certain facets of a more what they considered relaxed policy around not issuing correction notices or not requiring proof of identification. And, they sort of were like, well, we can have these inclusive policies, but we really need to keep all of these, other structural things as is. And that was not sufficient because, we're not just talking about a sort of preference for these sorts of things. We're talking about the way that old policies functioned was actually very severely detrimental to transgender authors. And so it took a lot for us to convince them to listen to us 100%. This is not a negotiation. This is you listening to a community that is being actively harmed by something that you have in place. And after sort of pushing and pushing and pushing for about a year and a half, we were able to convince some larger journals, ACS and Wiley included, though they didn't need very much pushing. They did a really good job of just sort of blanket supporting us. And after about a year and a half, we actually were able to meet with COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics, to discuss the ruling that actually had led to the sort of legal implications for journals and publishers trying to support transgender authors. And with them, we worked with them for about a year to put together a new set of guidelines that would replace the previous COPE ruling that would give journals and publishers a guideline for being able to implement their own new supportive name change policy, written and constructed entirely by transgender and non-binary authors. You can go to the next slide. And so these will be coming out later on this year, which is really exciting. And they sort of, this is just the layout of what it's going to look like. And again, these are guiding principles. So, all of the sort of details about all of these components of a name change policy, have been implemented in lots of different ways, but a lot of which we really like. And so this is sort of the bones of it. And so first, that a name change policy should be accessible. So it means that the author, upon request, isn't given any sort of barriers or burdens in submitting their request. Comprehensive, which means that all instances of the author's previous name should be replaced in the records maintained and disseminated by the publisher. Invisibility, so not drawing attention to the gender identity of the author or creating a clear juxtaposition between the two names. Expediency and simplicity, so that the name should be implemented in a timely manner and with minimum bureaucratic overhead. And then recurrence and maintenance, that publishers should regularly audit and correct new instances of changed names in order to prevent the dissemination of incorrect information. This is the sort of culmination of about a year and a half of working with COPE. Things have gone really, really well with them, and we're kind of excited that we're now going to have this top-down guidance for any publishers of any size to be able to accomplish this. And that's it.
Okay, Shana, over to me, I guess. Thanks, Irving, and thanks, Shana. I'm Anna O'Brien, and I was involved in the rollout of the revised name change policy at Wiley recently. Thanks to the ISMTE for asking me to provide the publisher's perspective today on this important question of what's in a name. So I can speak to why this matters to us at Wiley, to the practical side of implementing this kind of name change policy. I'm going to talk a little bit about the inclusion of pronouns in the literature, which is something we're being asked to do increasingly. But also I'll try to give a flavour of the kind of conversations we've had along the way at Wiley as we've moved towards a more inclusive publishing environment. Next slide, please, Shana. So why does a publisher care about this? In this context on this slide, research is the name of Wiley's journal's business, and that's a knowledge business. So we publish journals that seek to solve the world's biggest problems. And we really believe that diversity can only strengthen that knowledge. So we invite all researchers in all their glorious diversity to contribute to those conversations and to the academic record. And we believe that offers the best path to solving those global problems. So this is our 4-step approach that you can see here to reviewing all of our editorial policies and processes through a lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we're really trying to weave DE&I into our strategy. And I want to point to this first pillar here, because that's really where we've spent a huge amount of time in the past 18 months, just listening and learning to the communities of authors that we serve to make sure that we're meeting their needs. And actually, we're really grateful to Irving and to the Name Change Policy Working Group in particular, because it's their generosity in sharing their lived experience with us that really shaped the policy that we have now. So if you too are open to listening and learning in this space, I really recommend that you seek out some of the written work of that group, because it's been incredibly helpful to us. Next slide, please, Shana. So the author name change policy that Wiley introduced in 2020, December 2020, was not entirely new. We always had a name change policy. But through that process of listening and learning, we realized that there were two aspects of our now old policy that were not only not sufficiently supportive to our trans community of authors, but as Irving has said, they had a potentially detrimental effect on that community. So those two aspects were that we used to require the publication of a correction notice whenever we changed an author's name in a paper. And we also used to notify co-authors. Now, I don't expect any of you to read that tiny text on the right with the new policy, but allow me to just highlight the key differences here. So we now update and republish the PDF and the HTML versions of an individual paper where a name change has taken place. That's not different from the old policy. We always did that. We will continue to work with third-party abstracting and indexing services who use and republish our content elsewhere to implement the name changes. And again, that was something we always did. But then the third point is where we start to move into new territory, and where we particularly differ from the old policy is we now use discretion as a driving force in all of this. So that means requiring neither a correction notice in the paper, and we don't any longer require or even suggest that an author notify their co-authors. Next slide, please, Shana. So if you'll allow me to walk you through our sort of simplified process, and I want to be very clear that all credit here goes to Wiley's production and content delivery colleagues who have worked alongside us in creating this policy to make this as straightforward as possible. So the critical piece here for us is that first step. So our first response to an author requesting a name change should never be anything other than a clear and resounding yes, we can when they ask to change their names. So the author is immediately reassured that, yes, we can make the name change, but critically that there will be no correction notice and no co-authors will be notified. Now that email step sounds like a really simple and straightforward thing, but actually behind it was a huge education piece for not only our in-house colleagues in helping them understand the need for this discretion, but also across our vendors where we have outsourced production operations. So that was a really critical piece of work for us. In the email, we do advise that the author changes their name in the journal's electronic editorial office or submission system. And we also recommend that they link their new name to their ORCID profile just to ensure a seamless publication record. We do verify the author's identity, but crucially, we don't ask the author to supply proof of their own identity, and we certainly don't ever ask of the reason for the name change. I think that's a really important piece of that discretion that underlies our work here. So the author ID is really verified for the avoidance of error at this stage. So once that in-house verification is complete, the PDF and the HTML articles are both corrected, and they're also republished, and we take great care to, before we republish them, to ensure that the author's dead name is removed at every instance it might occur. So it could be in the email address, it could be in a bio, it could be in the reference list. And just to make sure that we've really done that work properly, the author receives a proof prior to republication. So at the point of republication, we resupply the metadata to third parties. And I'm going to come back to that piece in a moment because there are some complications there that I want to be transparent about. And then finally, and I think as critical as that first piece of communication, we have an opportunity as a publisher to really go the extra mile here in supporting authors. And I have a really good example of that from Wiley's Psychology and Human Behavior team, which received a name change request for an individual article from an author. And what my colleague did was said, well, okay, great, we'll change your name. But having looked at Wiley Online Library, our digital platform, I can see you have another 14 publications in Wiley published journals. Would you like me to coordinate the name change request across all of those papers? Which was just such a great way of showing support for this community of authors. And actually the author was so delighted with that they were very public in kind of tweeting their praise for that team member, which was really nice to see. Jumping back to that resupply of content to third parties, this for us has been much less straightforward than we might have thought. And that is because the third parties we work with choose or prefer to work in a variety of ways. So some of them, like PubMed Central, have been happy for us to resupply the metadata, and then they republish the content with the corrected name, but again, without a correction notice. Other parties like Clarivate, Web of Science, and Scopus prefer us to use their own web form, which we're very happy to do and have been doing. I'm going to be really transparent and say the big challenge for us has been Google Scholar, and it's purely because they work completely differently. They don't allow us to push content to them. They pull it by crawling our online platform. And then they collate these corrections that need to happen, and they attend to them at sort of periodic intervals. And it's a bit of a mystery as to how long those intervals are, but we've certainly seen cases where we have removed an author's dead name and it's taken 3 to 6 months for Google Scholar to play catch up and to make that correction themselves. And we're always disappointed when we have to go back to authors and say, I'm afraid we have no agency over that. Next slide, please, Shana. Thank you. So on to pronouns. Increasingly, authors are asking us to include their pronouns in the literature. The critical thing to say is that we can and we do accommodate author pronouns now, and you can see here at the top how they're displayed in a PDF file. I have to confess we have more work to do, to be completely transparent. So at the moment, these pronouns are only visible in the PDF and not in the HTML. And that's no lack of willingness on our part. We actually undertook a huge piece of work to overcome some tagging complications in our kind of standard markup language. I'm glad to say that as of last week, that's now happened. And we now have a space in that schema, that Wiley proprietary schema, for author pronouns. So already those pronouns are being tagged and they're traveling with the content wherever it may be redelivered. However, until we do the next scheduled release of Wiley Online Library, the next update in November, they're not yet visible in the HTML, but we're almost there. And I wish we'd got to that point before I was presenting today, but hold that thought, we're nearly there. A final really important point to note on pronouns is that we've instructed Wiley colleagues and our copy editing and typesetting vendors never to edit pronouns in any way, but to allow them as free text to accommodate completely free author choice. And if anyone listening today is in any doubt as to why pronouns are important or whether pronouns are important to our communities, the tweet you see at the bottom there is a really good example of the kind of positive feedback we get, particularly on Twitter, from authors for whom the inclusion of pronouns is incredibly important. Next slide, please, Shana. Thank you. So where next for this work? What more needs to be done so that we're continuing to uphold the rights of trans researchers and create a greater atmosphere of inclusion in publishing? First, Wiley and other publishers recently partnered with the US Departments of Energy. The ACS, I know, is a partner in that too. And so their 17 national labs are now acting as a centralized source of these name change requests for authors who are employed by the US DOE. So that really alleviates the certainly the administrative and possibly the emotional burden on the individual. And as a publisher, I'm keen to explore whether other research institutions might want to take that same approach. So that's one possibility. It's true to say that we certainly hope for greater standardization and expediency in some cases for third-party ANI services when correcting author names in widely published content. We're starting to look at the visual representation of authors. So again, that could be in a biographical piece within an article. It could be a photograph in an article of researchers at a conference, and thinking about how we handle the visual representation of authors who may undergo this kind of transition. And then really we're continuing to speak very openly about our progress and also about the challenges we're having to overcome. So there's a really open and free information exchange between the publishers who are signatories of the Royal Society of Chemistry-led Joint Commitment for Action on Inclusion and Diversity in Publishing. And it's been a real joy in this work, actually, to work with counterparts at other publishers without any sense of competition, all supporting each other and moving towards this future state and helping each other through the challenges. And then finally, this is an evolving space. Author needs will continue to change, and it's really critical that we continue to listen to them so that we can continue to adapt our offerings to them. Shana, that's it from me. I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Irving, for both of those great presentations. We now have a few minutes for Q&A. So just a reminder to all of our participants, feel free to pop any questions into the Q&A box. I don't see any at the moment, but I'd love to maybe open it up to some questions. One of the things that, and I'll start off, one of the things that came to mind, Anna, as you particularly touched on some of the major challenges that I know many of us publishing organizations are facing and kind of sharing how we're tackling them. I'm curious to hear from your perspective, what were some of the major challenges? You touched on a few that you faced during implementation, and how did Wiley tackle them?
I would say that the major challenges we faced could be described as philosophical rather than practical. The practical ones are the easy ones to work through, right? So we had a lot of discussions, or rather a lot of questions about the integrity of the academic record. So we just took an alternative viewpoint there, I think. We take incredibly seriously our responsibility as guardians of what's been written, but name changes don't alter what's been written. They record who wrote it or who wrote the science. And from my perspective, changing a name means the scientific record remains intact. The author's name is not a part of the scientific contribution. It's about attribution and communication, contact with that individual. And from my perspective, that really, autonomy over that should sit with the individual contributor to the academic record. I don't know if Irving would add anything to that.
No, I agree. Yeah, that, it's sort of this, because I think when we first started working on this, that was a concern that was brought up quite a lot. And that there was a correction notice before kind of like was an indication to us that that publishers saw a name change as a correction to the public record, not something that was, like compromising the integrity of the, say like the even like the historical value of a published work. And so even though previous name change policies were not good for transgender authors for various reasons, that it was still that there was a consensus around the fact that those policies existed meant that there was a consensus around that idea. And so I definitely agree. And I think that, even more so, again, when we think about why policies looked the way that they used to, it's this idea that this assumption that is incorrect, which is a name is, unchanging, a name is static. And, if you look at the people who are now publishing, there's only a small subset of people for whom that assumption is true. There's actually a ton of people who don't fit that bill. And it just so happens that, transgender authors, it was detrimental enough to them to have their previous identity, still present in the publishing world, to be so vocal about it. And so, yeah, I think, you were, it's correct. Yeah, you're spot on. And I think that, the way that things are changing as well, is again, has a sort of cascading effect where it's not exclusively helping this single subset of people, but, lots of folks who, for whom a name is not static.
Thank you. I think you touched on this idea of potentially fraudulent behavior and trying to overcome that that hurdle. And we have received a couple questions, I think, along those lines. So how do you control against potential misuse? And I think on a related note, another question is, one of the steps was to verify the author ID. Can you share how this is done in a respectful way? Anna, would you mind kicking us off?
Sure. So the first question you mentioned about potential misuse, we thought about that long and hard, and I think I would probably flip that question on its head and ask why we would anticipate misuse or fraudulent activity related to name changes. We had a policy for a long time. Very few people actually asked us to change their names. And when we released the new policy in December, perhaps because it was more supportive, perhaps because we made a lot of noise about it, because we felt good about it, we suddenly had a flood of name change requests. And to my knowledge, we've not encountered a single instance of misuse or fraudulent activity. And I would go further and say that we don't actually require evidence of identity at any stage of the publication process, from submission through to post-publication. So we could receive extensive corrections to a proof from an author, but we don't go through any kind of verification process for that. The whole system works on integrity and trust. And if that should ever break down, there are, of course, many, many thousands of papers where that doesn't happen. And yes, there are always unscrupulous individuals who might seek to game the scholarly publishing system in many, many ways, as we all know. But I'm not sure that identity checks would prevent that. So we have the support of organizations like COPE. Many of the larger publishers certainly have their own in-house research integrity offices. And so in any rare instances, we have that support behind us, but really we haven't experienced it yet, and we don't anticipate it either. Just very quickly, though, to answer the other question about how we verify the author ID in as respectful a way as possible, I think what I meant by that is we don't go back to the author requiring anything of them. It's quite often resolved with a very simple check of the requesting author's email against their ORCID ID. It could be, if that doesn't bear fruit, it could be a quick Google search, but generally speaking, it's a very quick check, and that is to guard against the introduction of error, not to prove the author is who they say they are.
Interesting. Thank you. Kind of related question that I had was around the invisibility guideline that should be coming out from COPE. And maybe this is a question for you, Irving. There was a question that came across at ACS recently from another publisher, actually, who was looking to implement an inclusive author name change policy. But there was a preference to at least, and I think motivated by preserving the record, to kind of put in the byline was updated on X date. What are your thoughts on that, particularly related to that invisibility guideline?
That's a great question. And I apologize in advance. My puppy just realized that I am not paying attention to her and has been whining. So you might hear that a little bit in the background. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Jeffrey, down, 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 down. There you go. Anyways, so yeah, I think again, in ideally, we sort of have this like gold standard of what we think would be most supportive of trans authors. But I think that it is sort of expected, and we should expect to have then a sort of like spectrum of compliance. And so with some of the, with, again, like Shana was just saying, like some folks are really, sort of afraid of the implications of not including any notice that the publication was changed. And oftentimes when I get that sort of question, I just push back on where is that fear coming from? Until 2010, their publishing was not exclusively, online. That like this is a very new field, at least in terms of the breadth of technological advances that have happened in such a short period of time. And so to me, it's always like I sort of scratch my head when someone is, concerned about preserving the public record. And my thoughts are, well, like we haven't been in this kind of a publishing sphere for very long. So why would you expect nothing to change? And so I sort of start with that. But I think that if in cases where, that you want to include something, again, the sort of guideline for not including a correction notice is that you draw no juxtaposition between the two names, or that there was any sort of change in identity that's related to gender. And so in the case of just putting the date that the paper was updated, that actually in some cases can be beneficial, at least in alerting somebody who's citing the paper that paper had changed more recently. And so at least in that case, in some cases, folks have actually discussed how that might be a good intermediary step before we can figure out better ways of addressing the sort of publishing aggregators like Google Scholar or PubMed, until they're more active and faster at updating names, that maybe this might be a good intermediary. But I want to also kind of throw some caution out there, in that it's still sort of a watermark of this previous assumption that the only reason why something would be changed is because it's wrong or bad. And I think that what we want and what I would want is that there's no attention drawn to it. And so you're still going directly against the request of a community that has been historically harmed by this exact thing. And so while I think it is good as an option that still fits the bill for invisibility, personally, I prefer not to have it.
Thank you, Irving. So we just have a few minutes left, and I think you're starting to point to kind of what further changes we're looking to in the industry. So I'd love to hear if there's no other questions in the Q&A, which I don't see any, but please feel free to continue popping those in. I would love to hear, in terms of further changes needed in the industry, if both of you could kind of magically implement one change tomorrow, what would that change be and why? And maybe Anna, we can start with you.
So for me, it would be all publishers maintaining self-reported demographic data on their authorship, their editorial boards, their editorial teams in a standardized way, and in a way that our community trusts us to collect and handle and use wisely. In the time that I've been doing this work in diversity, equity, and inclusion, that is one of the most practically challenging pieces that we as a publisher, rather than as a member organization, have really struggled with. There are huge legal complexities. GDPR is a whole complication that I won't even go into, but I probably sat in more meetings trying to overcome that question of where we collect the data, which questions we ask, who has access to the data, how we use the data. That's probably the really big one for me.
Thank you, Anna. Irving?
That's great. I think my answer's along the similar lines. Sort of the whole goal of these, what I'm going to call initial changes, because I think that we are at the foot of a large wave of change that's going to be happening. But I think that, this idea of author autonomy has been sort of at the forefront of new name change policies, that having some external, organization or individual who has authority over how you're allowed to identify in the publishing space is something that is outdated, I think, and I think is not helpful or desired by any individual. I think that autonomy is valued a lot, and so in terms of elevating that autonomy to the next level, I think that there's a middleman here, even with inclusive name change policies, and that's the publisher or the journal that is implementing the policy. And, it's extra work. And a lot of people don't like extra work, and it's good work, but it still is extra work. And I think that, sort of what I think the next evolution in this change is having people consider, the way that the system was developed in the first place is structured around authors' names as a point of non-change. And so what would publishing look like if you cannot rely on an author's name as something that is consistent? And we're not talking about printed articles. These are electronic archives, and changing things in them is a lot easier than changing something in physical print. And so what I sort of see, if I woke up the next day and everything was perfect, that authors would start publishing with an ID, kind of like in ORCID ID, and that from an author profile that is only accessible by the author, could you then change your demographic information as it evolves, like your name or your gender, and that would then populate in places like the title and the author line, also in citations, and a lot of other places. So it's sort of these things are all sort of connected, and they're also built not using a name, because I think that as we think about these larger challenges, right, the easiest thing to do was actually change the author name. All of these other things are much more challenging, and they would be solved not by just writing over what already exists, but sort of starting from ground zero again.
Thank you, Irving. Yeah, I think you're painting the picture of what a very inclusive research ecosystem could look like. That's a great starting point. So we just have a minute left, so I do want to wrap up. Given that I think everyone actually indicated in the beginning that they already have inclusive name change policies, this poll, we'll see where this goes, but we wanted to follow up now that you've heard from our speakers on what the most inclusive policy looks like, how your thoughts might have changed on post-publication name updates. And so the options are, we already have an inclusive name change policy and this session maybe confirmed your approach. You already have an inclusive name change policy, but we'll be considering improvements. This session has changed your perspective on name change policies, or the session did not change your perspective. And you can choose multiple options here. I'll give folks a few more seconds here, and I'll close the poll in 3, 2, 1. And it looks like we're split. I know we had a lot of folks who already had inclusive name change policy, so it's great to see that maybe this session at least confirmed your approach. So this is really useful. Thank you all so much for attending. Thank you, Anna and Irving, for presenting. And we'd love to stay connected with you, so please feel free to use the hashtag ISMTE Global if you're on social media, and to stop by the Exchange Forum as well. So thank you all again, and hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.